Check, check. Oh. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. It's wonderful to have this group and this sort of intimacy in our conversation today. It's going to be a real treat for all of us. For those whom I have not yet met, I'm Susan Lee Vick, the Chief Executive Officer here at Joybound. And it is a real treat for us to have our featured speaker, Steve Feldman, visiting. I do want to say that neither Steve nor I have personally experienced some of the challenges that our racially and ethnically diverse pet parents have. We do not speak today from the position of leadership. We are not leaders, but we are learners. And so what we're gathered together to do is to have open conversations to how we can more effectively ensure that the undeniable benefits of the human-animal bond are accessible for all, not just for the elites. So some of the questions that we will explore is how can we better conduct our operations here at Joybound and our other partner organizations who are present with us today? How can we be more welcoming? How can we more effectively apply the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and above all, belonging in our work? And also, what role are we collectively going to commit to as leaders in this space to spread these values through our communities and beyond? So to that end, we are very fortunate, as I have said, to have HABRI represented by Steve here, because the Human-Animal Bond Research Institute, this organization is a premier voice for research in our sector, partnered with Petco Love to bring a study to life to help us benefit from the data that they gathered to understand what is really happening in shelters, in veterinary practices, in pet supply retail situations. What kind of interactions are diverse pet families having? What are they encountering? And how might we want to change based on what we learn? We are especially honored that after a year and a half of besiegement, Steve did in fact get on an airplane and fly out here to spend the day with us. Steve is President and CEO of HABRI, and he is personally a champion of exploring diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the animal welfare sector. Steve's an experienced public affairs advocate also in wildlife conservation and healthcare, education, and animal well-being also. He has been leading the groundbreaking work at HABRI for over a decade now. Before joining HABRI, Steve served as Senior Vice President for External Affairs, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And he worked in public affairs consulting and also in the US Senate, and he says,
don't hold that against me.
Yeah, we've rehearsed that. Steve has a bachelor's degree in international affairs and a master's in political management from George Washington University. And we are thrilled that he turned his extraordinary talents and passion, expertise, and fascination for the cause to the issues we're going to support today, which will help us improve the work we do every day, and made time to join us to share his findings. So, without further ado, let's welcome Steve.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you all for being here, for braving traffic and being in the room, and thanks to the live streamers for watching as well. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the human-animal bond and a little bit about HABRI first, and then we'll get into the topic of the day. So the American... Uh-oh. The American Veterinary Medical Association defines the human-animal bond as a mutually beneficial, dynamic relationship between pets and people, where we're responsible for their well-being and they're responsible for our well-being. They help us with our mental, physical, and social health. The AVMA, of course, is focused on veterinary medicine, and so they say the veterinarian's role is to maximize the potential of this relationship between people and animals and to promote the health and well-being of both. But I would encourage you to put your own name in there. Maybe my role is to maximize the human-animal bond. I certainly think that is true for the animal welfare community. All right, I'm going to try and hit the slide advance again. We'll see what happens. Yes, okay, there we go. The National Institutes of Health goes even further and says no future study of human health is complete unless we examine the role of pets in the home and our relationship with those pets. And that's where HABRI comes in. Our vision is that the human-animal bond is universally embraced and is as an essential part of human wellness. We're studying the human health benefits of pets, and we first engage in scientific research and then educate people, and then where possible we advocate for a more pet-friendly society because we know that pets are important for individuals, for families, for entire communities. How do we do this? We fund scientific research, over 50 studies and growing, and then we use that to create educational tools and try and impact policy and create a more pet-friendly society. So whether it's housing or pets in the workplace or taking the message to Capitol Hill or even helping pets in natural disasters, this is what we try and do with our work. So I'm just going to, instead of sharing all 50 projects, because that would take all the time we have, I'm just going to show you the most recent 4 that we funded just to give you a sense of the work that we're doing. This first one is evaluating the impact of station dogs on first responders, so police and fire, whether we can improve the mental health and well-being for those public servants. And that's at the University of Arizona. This next one we just actually announced this week at Colorado State, looking at pet owners, pet parents on their cancer journey. What do they need? What are their special needs, and how can we meet their needs so that they can keep and care for pets while they're going through their cancer journey? And that's going to result in a website with resources for cancer survivors so that they can have their pets by their sides. At The Ohio State University, they're using some very sophisticated chemical measurements to look at both the welfare of horses and victims of trauma who are going through equine-assisted therapy. And so that'll be groundbreaking in terms of measuring the welfare of both the animals and the people. And at Florida Atlantic University, we're looking at how pets help children of military families who have unique stresses in their lives. So it gives you just a broad, just these most recent 4 give you a broad sense of the kinds of research projects we are funding. And why is this important to you? Well, this is not from the study I'm about to share with you, but this is from our benchmark survey of over 3,000 pet owners. And what we asked people point blank, if you knew more about the scientific research that showed the health benefits of pets, what would it do? Well, I have a slide also that I showed of vets that say they're more likely to go to the veterinarian. And I have one for nutrition companies that says they're also more likely to feed their pets higher quality nutrition. But for you, they're more likely to recommend a pet to a friend or family member. The darker bar is the strongly agrees, and the lighter bar is the somewhat agrees. So 50% more likely to recommend a pet to a family member, strongly agree. Get another pet in the future, and get an additional pet. Now, in this survey, 54% of the pet owners had 2 or more pets, and yet they'd say they'd get a third or a 4th pet just knowing about the science. So I encourage you to figure out how to carry forward these messages and share this kind of information. If you're talking about the benefits of pets for veterans with post-traumatic stress, if you're talking about improved heart health, improved mental health, which is something a lot of us learned, I think, about our pets during the pandemic, sharing that information really strengthens the bond, and a lot of good pet-parent behaviors happen as a result of this. All right, so that's my About HABRI portion of the talk. Let's get into the discussion of the day. So what challenges do we face? And I would argue that all the challenges and inequities that we face in society can be found in the pet care ecosystem. Susan mentioned this. We looked at animal shelters and rescues. We looked at pet stores, and we looked at vet clinics. That forms a large part of the pet care ecosystem. I'm going to share a little bit of the pet store and vet clinic data, but mostly I'm going to focus on the animal welfare space for the purposes of our presentation today. So Petco Love generously funded this work to understand the role of race and ethnicity in the pet care ecosystem. Our central question was to study how the human-animal bond was experienced among pet parents of color, and then how do these various groups interact with the pet care ecosystem. So we started, of course, with the positive, the strength of the human-animal bond, and then we went from there. So here's what we're going to talk about today. First, I'll cover the survey methodology, and then we'll talk a little bit about the strength of the human-animal bond. I mean, it's in our name, so I want to start with that. Then pet acquisition. How and why did people get their pets? And then we'll get into the experiences with animal welfare, the barriers that people face, and then some possible ways that we can overcome those challenges. And we'll definitely leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to start by sharing just some of the top-line key findings, and we'll get into the details in a minute. First of all, you should know that the human-animal bond is strong across all groups. There really weren't big differences. And that pet ownership contributes to social connection and cohesion. However, lack of diversity may hinder access to pets, access to pet care, and exclude the pet parents who might otherwise be supporting your mission. But the solution is pretty simple. If we can increase diversity and representation and create a welcoming environment, we can overcome these challenges. So here's the methodology slide. What you should know is we spoke to adults in the United States who were involved in their pets' care, and we did this between January and February of 2022, so not too long ago. We spoke to 500 Black pet parents, 500 pet parents of East Asian descent, 500 pet parents of Latinx who were English bilingual. Oh, and I want to say this. The folks, the DEI team at Petco said you should use the term Latinx. And every time I give this presentation, somebody says, well, here are two other terms that you should use. And what I say is, I don't have any standing to weigh in on that debate. It is not up to me. So I just ask for a little bit of grace in this whole discussion and openness, and not focus so much on terms, but focus on what the data shows. So if that's not the term that you would like, I get that, but I'm not the one who gets to decide. Okay, and then 136 Spanish speakers. And then we had this other category, which was really, we grouped it into Native American, Pacific Islander in one group, and Indian and Middle Eastern in another. And I know maybe those don't belong together, but we had to create a grouping that was large enough for us to do some analysis. So no survey is perfect. Race and ethnicity is complicated, and people often have multiple identities, and you can't capture all of that in a survey. We did our best, and hopefully you'll find the data useful. So let's talk about the human-animal bond. I mentioned before that the human-animal bond is experienced universally with strong bonds across all ethnicities, and everyone considers pets to be part of the family. So how did we measure the bond? Our HAB score scale is a scientifically validated 14-question survey. So we looked at things like attachment. My pet and I have a close relationship. Humanization. My pet is my best friend. My pet is part of my family. Commitment. Nothing would ever convince me to give up my pet. If my pet needed extensive veterinary care, I would pay whatever it takes. Integration. My pet's allowed on the bed, or we travel together. And if you're answering yes to all of these, that means you're going to score a 70 because it's a 5-point scale. So if you answered ones to everything, which nobody did, you'd get a 14. And if you answered fives, you'd get a 70. And just one other piece of math, everything over a 56 means people were answering fours and fives. And that's important because then when you look at different groups by race and ethnicity, here's what you find. You can do this for an individual, you can do this for a group, you can do this for everyone, but here's what you find. There's no real statistical difference between groups. The difference between a 56 or a 58 is not a statistically significant difference for purposes of this survey. So, I mean, if you had to pick a winner, you'd say that Indian, Middle Eastern, English, and bilingual Latinx come out a little bit ahead, but really what this shows is, across the board, incredibly strong human-animal bonds. So I actually want to show you the questions and the answers we got. Number one was my pet is part of my family. Now, if you see the ones in blue, those were some experimental questions that weren't part of the HAB score scale, but I really wanted to ask them anyway. So many people in their open-ended responses in previous surveys talked about laughter, that I wanted to ask the laughter question, and came out right below pets or family, my pets make me laugh. And the third one, my pet and I have a close relationship. So you can see in the columns the scores for each group, and you can see no significant differences across the board. 80s, 90s at the top, and there are no real differences by race or ethnicity. You go a little further down the scale, and you do see a few little differences emerge. The Latinx community likes to dress up their pets and celebrate holidays. And I always have somebody come up and say, yeah, that's me. And so you can see a few differences on taking your pets to work or things like that, but not huge differences where it really counts in terms of measuring the human-animal bond. We also asked this question: which of the following best describes the role of your pet in the household? And no surprise that like a family member and like a child came out on top. And by the way, the highest bond scores match up to like a child. So if somebody's talking about fur babies, they're going to have a high human-animal bond score. And by the way, like a child flips to the #1 score for the younger pet owners. So there are incredibly strong bonds for our newest pet owners. Not too many just a pet. And I won't go into the details on these, but there is a strong commitment to pet care. 35% of all pet parents say money is no object. And that number does not change when you break it down by socioeconomic group. So the lower income pet owners are still very strong on money's no object. And what that might mean to them is different, but that's why we asked the question this way. 35% money is no object. And when we asked about vet visits across the board, 2, 2.1, 2.2, across the board, everybody was going to the vet twice a year. So what does this mean? It means that the bonds are strong no matter who walks in the door. It means the commitment to spending is strong no matter who walks in the door. And everybody's going to take good care of their pet. They're going to go to the vet. So it's a little bit of myth busting. If you see somebody who maybe doesn't look like your typical adopter come through, it doesn't matter. We know that their bond is going to be incredibly strong. So let's talk a little bit about pet acquisition. 58%, this was the #1 answer, said they acquired their pets for companionship. Emotional support was a strong #2. But we did see some other differences when we asked, how they got their pet. 22% of Black and Latinx pet parents said their pet was a gift, compared to 10% for white pet parents and 12% for pet parents of East Asian descent. So how many of you would just have discouraged gifting? And why would you, right? You're maybe ignoring a cultural difference. The Latinx community was really oriented towards kids and really oriented towards gifting. So I want to get this pet as a gift for my kids. That's something that's going to be okay, and it needs to be okay. So let's take a look at the chart for a second. You can see that the East Asian pet parents were the ones who really topped out on shelter. Breeder came in very strong, as did friend and family member. And there you can see the numbers on pet store and gift. And there may be some reasons for this, which we'll get into in just a second. This is for dogs, by the way. And here's what the cat chart looks like. Again, East Asian pet parents going to the shelter. And of course, you see stray and friend or family member jumping up a little higher for cats. Give you a second to take a look at that. Not huge differences, really. That said, acquiring a pet can be a challenge. When we asked people if they were ever unsuccessful, 1/5, 1 in 5 said they had been unsuccessful, and we said, where were you unsuccessful? And the #1 answer was from an animal shelter. So people tried, and they weren't able to, which maybe explains some of the numbers that you just saw. So how is the animal welfare community serving pet parents of color? Let's take a look at that. First, the circles are, have you been to an animal shelter or rescue in the past 12 months? So usually you see about 20% who've been to an animal shelter. And what was the #1 reason? I was looking to adopt a pet. But look at those volunteer numbers in the Black and Latinx community. Those are very strong, 1 in 5, saying, yeah, I would have liked to have volunteered. And you'll see this again on a later slide. The Spanish-speaking Latinx community is looking for veterinary care. They're looking for medical care for their pets. So if you offer veterinary services, You should be offering those in Spanish, and you should be welcoming that community in particular, because they were also going to pet stores looking for medical care. They were going any place but the clinic. And that's what our data tells us. So why didn't you go? And I just want to point out, for the Latinx community, I didn't know what services they offered, or I wasn't even aware of a local shelter or rescue in my community. Now, you know that shelter or rescue is there, right? These are people who are going to pet stores and giving pets as gifts, and they're not coming to the shelter. So maybe amp up the outreach. And by the way, I will say I'll make the slides available to any of you also. So you can take notes, but I'll also make sure you have these so you can study them. It's a little bit of an eye test. All right, so we're going to get into some of the tougher challenges we face. And I think I'd just like to, we interviewed some folks, so I think I'd like you to listen to Sonia first.
So we put an application for another dog. He looked like a poor guy that he could use a good home. So we went there and we put the application in writing. Like they gave it. We already did online, but they want us to write the application again. We liked the dog. We felt sorry for him. He was a year old already. And they told us that we will hear back from them like in 2-3 weeks. That never happened. And they lost the application. They made me do it again. And then they gave the dog to someone else. And I was like pissed. Am I going to be buying a dog because they won't even let me rescue? I didn't know that it was because I have an accent. I know for a fact because you can tell when you're talking to the other person, even if they don't say anything, body language says a lot.
And let's listen to Shayla.
We were looking at a Labradoodle. At first, I tried a shelter, and that didn't really pan out well. I feel like it was kind of like a racial thing, honestly. I went in, had the application process, filled it out. Then we met with the dog, played with them a little bit to find out that we couldn't get it. Any explanation, none whatsoever. But I was young then, so I really didn't give any pushback. You know, my stepmom, she's mixed, so she's much lighter than I am. So she went back maybe about a month later. The dog was still there, and she ended up getting the dog for us.
So those are just two of the folks that we talked to telling their stories. So you'll notice I focused some slides on more broadly on people of color. This slide is focused specifically on Black pet parents. 22% had a negative experience at an animal shelter, and 21% said they felt discriminated against due to their race or ethnicity. Those are uncomfortably high numbers. So let's take a look. Have you ever had a negative experience at an animal shelter in the past? You can see that for our Indian and Middle Eastern group and for the Black pet parents, it was way higher, way higher. I mean, look at the East Asian pet parents. Their numbers were so low in terms of the negative experience that we couldn't even get sort of data on what that negative experience was and have that to be statistically relevant. So felt discriminated against, treated as naive and uninformed, made to feel I wasn't doing a good job of caring for my pet. These are some of the things that rise to the top. That's what the data tells us. When you ask people, when attempting to adopt a pet, you know, what challenges did you face? So for East Asian pet parents, it was about a time-consuming process, or the breed of pet I wanted wasn't available. Cost rises up, but again, you see staff being unhelpful, judged by staff due to my appearance, discriminated against due to my race and ethnicity, and no diverse employees, rising up a lot higher for Black and Latinx pet parents. In the vet clinics, we also face some challenges, and I'm just going to give you some top-line slides here. 53% pet owners of color said it is important for veterinarians and their staff to represent the racial and ethnic diversity in the communities they serve, and 34% said they had a harder time getting the veterinary services and veterinary care that they needed. This is also true for pet stores, where 50% said that there was no diversity in the pet stores and that that's a problem. And they also said harder time getting the pet supplies they needed. So before we get into some solutions, I want you to listen to Maria.
En el sur de Texas, entonces este ya está pegada con acuerdo con México. Me desesperé porque no había literal nadie, ninguna, como las asistentes que están ayudando, ni el veterinario, ni nadie, o sea, y había estado enferma y la llevé y le quería explicar de que no se lo podía decir ella, entonces me le dio un medicamento y yo no se lo di, no estaba ni siquiera segura de que me había entendido.
So what can we do to better serve pet parents of color? One of the things is really emerged very clearly is to offer Spanish language services. But I will say, and I got this originally as important feedback from audiences I presented this to, do not rely on Spanish-speaking employees to just do this. Make it part of their job description and compensate them for it. It is very important to not just say, hey, you speak Spanish, get over here, right? This has to be planned for, and this has to be done in a way that's respectful of your Spanish-speaking colleagues. So it has to be part of the job description. It has to be done right. I mean, hire a professional to do your website in Spanish. Don't just ask the receptionist who speaks Spanish to be able to do that. So we asked this in a couple of different ways. We said, what is the most important criteria when visiting a vet clinic, a pet store, or an animal shelter? So we forced people to choose the top 5 most important criteria. And guess what? People are consumers are the same. Cost, location, right? Cost, convenience, cleanliness came up very highly for animal shelters, hours of operation, and then you see friendliness also, employee friendliness, which is, I think, baseline, right? Employees should be welcoming and friendly when they're dealing with the public. We ask it a different way. What would make you more likely to visit these places? What would make you more likely? And now you see, makes me feel welcome. I mean, price is still there, but treats me with respect and empathy, makes me feel welcome, really starts to rise up. We really saw 2 main areas of focus: representation, pet parents of color not seeing themselves reflected in the pet care ecosystem, and then pet parents of color not being treated with respect, being judged, being treated as naive, and Spanish-speaking pet parents really wanting the services brought to them in their language. So here's what the first category looks like. Top 5, choose the top 5 for visiting: location, cleanliness, cost, hours of operation, and then employee friendliness falls in right behind that. But you see, for Black and Latinx pet parents in particular, I mean, you're talking about a quarter to a third saying diversity of staff, diversity of customers, really important to them. And then you see the Spanish language number jump off the page as well. Then when you ask it a different way, which is what would make you more likely to visit the shelter, there's the medical care again. Help me get medical care for my pet in the Spanish-speaking community. More transparency about fees. Dental care, not only just medical care, dental care for the Latinx community. And then diversity of employees, diversity of customers across the board. And by the way, what we saw was, especially in the East Asian pet parents and the white pet parents, was there's a huge generational divide. So I would assert that diversity is going to become even more important, because the younger East Asian pet parents and the younger white pet parents all rated diversity much more highly in those 2 categories in particular than their older counterparts. So let me close by saying pets are a force for good. 75% said that pets help bring people together from other walks of life, and 63% said it makes it easier to connect with other people. 83% across the board said that pets improve our mental health. So I'm going to argue that if pets are a force for good, then everyone sitting here today and everyone watching is a force for good as well. If you have something to do with bringing animals and people together, that means you're responsible for the human-animal bond, and you can help bring people together just by making sure they get the pets in their lives. And I'll share this story about Butter and Butter's mom. She was, and remember, we did this survey in beginning of 2022 when there were a lot of incidents of Asian hate, and she was spat upon and had some very vile things yelled at her. But it was her dog park community that really rallied around her and took care of her. And I'll just read this. Butter connected me with a community of pet parents who are empathetic and generous in spirit, and reminded me that even when faced with hate and fear, I must continue to choose love and trust. That's what we're all about. And so I want to make sure we covered that piece of this too. So again, the key findings: the human-animal bond and the willingness to spend on pets is strong across all racial groups and ethnic groups. Lack of representation can lead to discrimination and judgment, and hinder access to pets, to pet care, and exclude pet parents that would support your mission. Increase diversity and a welcoming environment. We can do this. Can create better life-saving, increase life-saving, and better serve pets and people. And that pet ownership is, pets are a force for good. We know this. And that, again, means you are a force for good. So our next steps. For my part, I'm here doing it, right? We're getting out there as much as we possibly can, and we are sharing this data. We're sharing this information to try and engage the entire pet care community to react and do better based on this information. And what can you do? Be welcoming and assume that every person who comes in the door loves and cares for pets, and make sure they walk out with one. Translate your website and your materials into Spanish, and start with your veterinary services. Represent diverse pet parents in all your imagery and in your social media. And look for existing DEI training programs. There are many good ones, and make it a requirement. And then really put your adoption and your volunteer process through this filter. Make it as transparent as possible. We saw transparency emerge. We were having some conversations about this today. To really just spell everything out so that people aren't walking away saying, how come I didn't get the dog, and why? Why was that? And then share these key findings as widely as possible. That's one of the reasons I'm going to make the slides available, so that you guys can go out there and share. And I'll make sure that you know how to find me if you want to learn more about that. All right, so you've been great to listen to all this. I wanted to share with you a video before we got to Q&A. So, and I know you're going to know the answer to this. What's the most famous animal welfare commercial that's ever been on television? Usually it's on TBS at late at night. Yes, Sarah McLachlan. So you all remember the Sarah McLachlan commercial, right? Well, we had the chance to reimagine the Sarah McLachlan commercial through the lens of the human-animal bond, so please enjoy.
Right now, millions of humans are suffering from solo binge watching, empty Instagram feeds, and broken exercise goals. But it doesn't have to be that way. We pets can give them the life they deserve. A life with reduced anxiety and depression, better heart health, and increased social interaction. It's not too late. Adopt a human today.
We had some fun with that. All right, so I am happy to talk with you and answer any questions that you might have.
We want people to take some notes here. If you have any questions, I'm happy to read them. Otherwise, I can take a microphone. Just a small crowd. Yeah. Kevin. Here we go. I like when she does Oprah. I know. It's like my other life.
So in regard to the data, what's the geography demographic of the number of people that you spoke with
This,
or interviewed for this survey?
so each column or each group was a representative sample of that population in the United States. So age, income, region was a statistically valid representation of that group in this country. So it was all spread out.
So there were people from the South, people from the North, people from...
That's correct.
Okay. And then on one of the slides, you mentioned that the diverse folks said that they weren't able to be successful at a shelter. Does that mean they were turned away? They didn't find a match? The question seemed a little vague to me as to why, because sometimes, I mean, I've come to adopt and it just wasn't
Right.
matched that week. and I
So
thought it was
sometimes
better, but-
well, I kind of divided up into two things. There were kind of process issues, and then there were people issues, right? And the process issue is the breed wasn't available, or it was a time-consuming process, or maybe there just wasn't a match that day. And then there was, I was judged, and I was made to feel that I wouldn't do a good job, and I was not well treated, and you could see that those differences emerged. So did we get as granular into each person as to exactly why? No, you can't really do that in a survey like this. But
no, I get that. And I mean, those are two buckets that at least,
Yeah.
versus saying that it just wasn't successful, my question would be like, gosh, were people not welcoming versus they didn't have the doodle thing I wanted? You know what I mean? Like,
well, and part of it is sometimes the lack of transparency. You could see somebody who, in the videos, right? I went in, I put an application, I wanted the dog, and then what happened? They don't know.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna check the line.
Sure.
But this is more for Susan or HR. So what are we doing about diversity?
62% of our hires this year are racially and ethnically diverse and excellent, I might add, in case anyone thinks that there's any lower bar. There is not. We hire excellent people, and our diversity is superb. That is against 46% last year, so we're growing and improving. Also, I will tell you that here at Joybound, any person who is a Spanish speaker is compensated at a minimum $2 an hour higher, and their job descriptions are including language about supporting those efforts. So we are not unrealistically calling them away from their primary responsibilities. Third, we're having Steve Feldman from the Human Animal Research Bond Institute come here to talk to us and educate us, and another 60 or so folks midday. So we are really beginning this. We also are about writing a grant for to underwrite diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging training for every Joybound employee, and it's mandatory as part of your orientation. So we mean it, and we know our dedicated volunteers care and mean it too.
Let me add to that. It's going to take a long time to diversify the veterinary profession, for example. It's one of the whitest professions there is. There's only one historically black college or university that has a vet school right now, although that's about to change. So it's going to take a long time to get more diverse veterinarians. But guess what? It's not going to take as long to diversify, for example, groomers, which is why you've got this great grooming academy. You can put diverse people through that training much more quickly, and we can start to see better representation in the pet care ecosystem in that way. So I think having that facility and the ability to train folks as groomers is another good example of how you can support diversity.
And I'll add to that, we have a strategic plan, you'll be seeing it, it was approved by the board last year, and we're activating now with the new fiscal year in January. We have 4 commitments. The second commitment is inclusive collaboration. We know that we're stronger if we're inclusive, and we know that we're stronger if we collaborate. And we want to take 1 and 1 equals 3 by intentionally collaborating in an inclusive manner. And so we're actively pursuing deep partnerships with parts of our community that perhaps
Okay, I'll throw out a couple questions.
Sure, go ahead, please.
So Steve, obviously you're interacting and engaging with so many organizations doing similar work as to us. Have there been any that you have seen that have just already begun to set the bar at a new level in terms of these kinds of conversations that, one, we should be aware of or perhaps even engaging with?
There's an organization called CARE, Companions and Animals for Racial Equity, which is doing some amazing work. We've been talking with them about how we can do more research. We actually also have a research project with the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health that's looking at the impact of pets on the stress caused by racism and discrimination. So we're trying to support that ourselves as well through that kind of work. Look, I think, so for example, there's the Diversify Veterinary Medicine Coalition, which is putting a huge amount of money into veterinary scholarships. So we're going to see some change. I just think it's going to take a little bit of time.
I have one more from the live stream. Okay, so what would a filter for adoptions and the volunteer processes look like? And do you have an example?
Well, I think, everything on the form should be well understood, and the process needs to be spelled out. And I'll give you an example from the Joybound form. It's got a lot of basic information that people have to put. And then at the bottom, there's these little boxes. It's for staff use, and it has these codes. It was like, there was one that was TAI. And I'm like, well, I don't know what TAI is. Oh, it's thinking about it, right? But I look at that as a kind of somebody who reads it, and I'm like, well, what does that mean? And they're filling it out, and they're checking it, and what does that mean? So maybe spell out what that is. Or tell people that we're collecting this information so we can improve, but it's not going to affect your ability to operate, to get an animal. Something even as simple as that, being a little more transparent. So sorry to pick on you, but I was noticing that at the front desk today, and I was like, what do these mean?
I'm not a social learner. We're all here as a leader, but rather as learners, and that's a great learning. Thank you. Who else?
I know you must all be dying to ask something. Great.
So obviously a lot of this comes back to people's implicit biases that they don't even realize that they have, right? But then I've done adoptions at a couple of different organizations, and I also see a lot just people struggling with things that aren't even, that are actually explicit, like, they're going to keep their dog in the backyard. I would never do that. So like I don't feel comfortable with that, but sometimes that's cultural, or, there's reasons for that, you may not understand because you have different life experiences. So how do you deal with things like that, like helping people get over those humps?
Well, that's why people have to go through training, to try and help overcome those implicit biases and understand that the human-animal bond may look different for that person or that family, but that animal is still going to be better off in many cases, certainly than being euthanized. And also, think about, and I know that you guys don't do this, but like some rescue groups are really into the home visit, right? Think about how people react, how different people might react to that kind of request. So we really need to make it transparent and simple, and find very few reasons to not give someone an animal when they really want one, because our data shows they're gonna love it and they're gonna take care of it.
So, if no one else has a question, any final questions? Once, twice? Okay, I'll ask one before I thank Steve. And my question is, you touched upon euthanasia. We know that the dynamics in the animal well-being sector have changed dramatically, and our public shelters are overcrowded. Overcrowding leads to animal decompensation, behavior issues. Those dogs become less adoptable. And when I think about that dynamic and the fact that we are turning away potential pet families, I wonder, Steve, Is there pent-up adoption demand there that we could be accessing if we were more welcoming to save more lives?
Well, you want to be as welcoming as possible, obviously, but then there are some external forces that I think that need to be dealt with as well. And I mentioned it just very briefly, and that was the one issue that I think you should care about most outside of the clinic walls, which is housing. We did a large survey of renters across the United States, and we found that 33% of people who had a pet in rental housing would get a second pet if the one pet restriction was lifted. By the way, restrictions often had to do with breed and size, especially obviously for dogs. And that 35% of renters who didn't have a pet because of restrictions would get a pet if they could. Wow. So if you look at how are we going to get more animals moving out, we got to create homes for them. And slowly working our way to reduce those rental restrictions is going to be one of the most effective ways to do that. By the way, you take that 33% and that 35% and you multiply it by the number of rental homes in the United States, that's 8 million more homes for dogs and cats and other animals if we can reduce those rental restrictions.
Yeah, that's what I call pent-up demand for our animals.
And I just want to underscore working with the unhoused community and people living on the edge. They still have dogs. And most people I talk to tell me they get them on Craigslist, and they spend way more for that dog on Craigslist than the adoption fee at a shelter.
So we actually did a dog acquisition piece of research with folks at PetSmart Charities, and we found about 30% came from shelters and rescues, about 30% came from breeders and pet stores, and the rest, 40%, came from what I would call the organic pet care ecosystem, friends, family, neighbors, community. I put Craigslist in that category. People are going to find a way to get these animals.
Well, Steve, thank you again. I'll just come up here and ask everyone to please join me in expressing our appreciation to Steve for this wonderful and enlightening discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Once again, right on time.
I think I get more of it every time I